Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo. Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo.
Welcome back. Part 4 of Chapter 7 of After Buddhism. This chapter is about name form, Namarupa, and consciousness. And Namarupa is another arguably more complex way that Gautama illuminates our experience. This nama is made up of touch, feeling, perception, intention, and attention. The Buddha says this is nama. And form is the 4 great elements, and the forms derived from them. This is rupa, says the Buddha. And Batchelor points out that consciousness is not included here in this model, as name form is seen as the condition necessary for consciousness to arise. And this has led to some heavy and confusing conversations between Mitchell and I off mic that we're going to continue examining, because this calls into question some things we're trying to figure out some other stuff that we've learned and how this all relates. And this idea of consciousness being interdependent on name and form brings up some interesting questions. But that's the idea here. So the Stephen Batchelor says, Gautama compares our entire physical sensorium to what we touch with our skin and sense with our bodies as heavy or light, damp or dry, mobile or immobile, warm or cool. And the idea here is that the 4 elements that we describe as form, the Buddha considered them in terms of like how we perceive them. So it hadn't gotten to where we talk about like atoms or molecules or things like that. So the idea of hot or cold, would probably be fire, I'm assuming, and like heavy or light as earth, So when we talk about the form being the 4 elements, that's how Gautama was thinking of this. And he comes back a couple times to the idea of touch in this section, and touch being a metaphor for whatever we come into contact with our senses. So there is, again, this interdependent framework here where there's some kind of touching happening between our experience and the perceived world. I don't know, any thoughts so far?
There's a paragraph I have marked on the next page over for me. It probably is going to just kind of summarize and reiterate some of what you just said. But so how does consciousness come about? Gautama explains in the next line, quote, with the arising of name form, there is the arising of consciousness. Consciousness emerges out of the entire complex of interactions between an organism and its environment. Consciousness cannot be said to be the exclusive product of either something physical, whether an external sense object or a brain, or something mental, whether a feeling, a perception, or an inclination. Gautama recognizes that consciousness is a seamless whole that is not equivalent to the sum of its parts, much in the same way that a hand as a whole is not reducible to the sum of its fingers, skin, bones, nerves, and muscles. Just as my hand can pick up a glass of water and raise it to my lips, which none of the parts can do on their own, so consciousness has a total unified awareness of what is happening that none of its constituents, feeling, perception, inclination, etc., can achieve on their own. To know something, the defining quality of consciousness, differs from merely perceiving something, the quality of perception, because it is a holistic awareness in which all of the nama factors of touch, feeling, perception, intention, and attention are integrated. By implication, for Gautama, there can be no such thing as, quote, pure consciousness, an unconditioned or pristine knowing that exists independently of the phenomenal world of discrete physical things and mental processes.
There's a lot in there.
I feel like that for me, it's like that clarifies and answers some questions and also kind of like raises more. But it is, I feel like one takeaway from that is just this idea of consciousness being something that arises, from these other constituents, but can't be reduced to them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that comes back again later.
Yeah. Yeah. And there is this interdependence. They're setting up the idea, like he uses the metaphor of two sheaves of reeds. If one is name and form, the other is consciousness. They kind of hold each other up. And if one falls, the other falls. That's if we're going to think about a potential duality or pair. I think the lesson here is that that's the more productive one to think about than mind and body, which he also talks about in here as being like, and I think that's how I've heard name and form described before, because he does kind of make the point that there is no and in it, but a lot of times we, in translation, make it name and form, and then people get hung up on this idea of like it being about mind and body when that's not the idea. And that Namarupa, in fact, is really nothing to do with mind. He gives a couple examples of why that would be. It doesn't mention consciousness at all, but consciousness is, again, interdependent on Namarupa. So it's better if we're going to think about two sheaves of reeds laying against each other. They're not mind and body. They're Namarupa and consciousness. The one thing I think we haven't talked about yet are like what these five are and like why these five. And folks may have noticed the inclusion of three of the bundles. So feeling, perception, intention, which here is the same as inclination. So the middle three of these nama factors are also the bundles: feeling, perception, and inclination. But we also have touch to start and attention. Touch here, he says, is pasa in Pali, which can be translated as contact. And so Namarupa is always a product of being in contact in some way or another. And Gautama says, with the arising of touch, there is the arising of feeling. With the arising of touch, there is the arising of perception. With the arising of touch, there is the arising of inclination. And so all of these things arise from touch. And so Stephen Batchelor says, touching an environment, Rupa, the first of the five bundles, immediately and simultaneously triggers the bundles of feeling, Vedana, perception, Sanya, and inclination, Sankhara. However, touch is not said to give rise to consciousness, the fifth bundle, Vijnana. And we already know with the arising of name form, there is the arising of consciousness. And Batchelor goes on to say, in many discourses, explains Gautama to his disciple Sati, the fisherman's son, who believes in an unconditioned consciousness, have I not stated consciousness to arise upon conditions, since without a condition there is no arising of consciousness? He goes on to show how consciousness is determined by the particular conditions that give rise to it. If consciousness is produced by eyes and forms, then it is visual consciousness. If it is produced by ears and sounds, then it is auditory consciousness, and so on. Consciousness is as impermanent, contingent, compounded, and varied as anything else in experience. Open your eyes upon a blue summer sky and visual consciousness occurs. Close your eyes again and that consciousness is gone. By contrast, we instinctively feel that consciousness lurks as a singular, constant witness somewhere in the background, waiting for the opportunity to see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something. As though to dispel this felt sense of consciousness's priority and privilege, Gautama emphasizes its derivative and mundane nature. He likens it to different kinds of fires. Gautama says, just as a fire is reckoned by what it burns, when it depends on logs, it's called a log fire. When it depends on dung, it's called a dung fire. So consciousness too is reckoned by the particular conditions that give rise to it. So yeah, there's definitely the claim here that consciousness is entirely contingent. And I think I'd used that word earlier, and corrected myself, but he actually says in here, Stephen Batchelor does, contingent. And I get the sense that that's what Gautama's saying too. All right. So we talked about consciousness as impermanent, contingent, compounded, and varied as anything else in experience. And I read this as being less about talking about what consciousness is and more about reorganizing our priorities. So like we ascribe so much value to consciousness, I think because we maybe relate our consciousness to who we are and that witness, that witness that was there when we were little kids, was there when we were, young adults, and it's there with us now. That consciousness is the thread. And so we kind of lift it up as this special quality. And we ascribe so much like value and permanence and superlatives to it. We kind of need the reminder that it's interdependent, just like the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, Putra Batchelor says, actually denies that consciousness is something to be refined or developed in our Dharma practice. And he says, understanding and consciousness, friend, these states are conjoined, not disjoined. You cannot separate one from the other in order to ascribe the difference between them. For what you understand, you are conscious of, and what you are conscious of, you understand. The difference between them is this: understanding is to be cultivated, bhavana, and consciousness is to be comprehended, parinya. So understanding and consciousness are best described in terms of what's to be done with them, as opposed to, again, like what they are. So this is a similar approach, I think, with the bundles. Rather than giving a specific definition, we're talking about how they're useful for the practice. And then he's got a quote from Gautama where Gautama says, Bhikkhus, it occurred to me, by what is consciousness conditioned? Through embodied attention, there occurred for me a breakthrough in understanding. When there is name form, consciousness comes to be. Consciousness has name form as its condition. When consciousness turns back, it goes back no further than name form. And I noticed here, it's interesting to hear the Buddha once again reference embodied attention. In the last chapter, I think mindfulness of body was suggested as a key method for understanding the unconditioned, unborn, those kind of things. So the other thing to note here is that the causality goes both ways. So like name form is the condition for consciousness, but consciousness is also the condition for name form. And the last thing I would share is that towards the final paragraph, about halfway through the final paragraph, he says, the key to understanding this synergy of name, form, and consciousness is to recall that experience, any experience, is simultaneously unified and highly differentiated. It is both a single coherent whole and a mass of whirling, contrasting detail. Just as the complexity of name form is needed to generate a unified consciousness, so a unified consciousness is needed to bring the complexity of name form into focus. Name form without consciousness would be chaos. Consciousness without name form would be meaningless. Anything else for part 4?
I did like the metaphor of like a dance, and it just says if one partner were to slip and fall, the other would crash to the ground as well.
Mm-hmm.
Describing the nama, rupa, and consciousness.
And this is, again, like these metaphors are coming back because there was a dance metaphor in the last chapter or the one before that too, right? There in terms of like pulling in and letting things be free, like having a balance between like holding and releasing.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So on to part 5, this chapter starts. Gautama describes what enabled his understanding of the interdependence of name, form, and consciousness as the practice of embodied attention. This statement brings us to the 5th and final nama factor, attention. Experience is triggered by finding oneself in touch with an environment, which simultaneously prompts feelings, perceptions, and intentions. But this description is incomplete. Not only does experience feel a certain way, make perceptual sense, and incline one to adopt a stance toward it, but one pays attention to what is happening and thinks about it. Such intimate reflections are the activity of the mind, which is the literal meaning of manasikara. There is a meditative quality to human experience. As conscious beings, we constantly ponder and worry about how we feel, what we perceive, and how we intend to respond to it all. That's interesting. So I think there's, like right there, we can see too that another aspect of our experience is this inclination to meditate on stuff in one way or another, even if that meditation is rumination, I think. And I think that's an interesting thing to highlight here, that we have that quality to our experience, and how are we using it?
True. Yeah. I feel like this distinction between disembodied or embodied attention is kind of significant too, because I just remember earlier thinking like the sort of promise of, or like the exciting possibility of like the sort of simple embodied mode of being, I guess, that practiced in the Dharma can lead us to, as opposed to here he kind of paints the picture of like disembodied attention, which is, I feel like, is helpful. He says, to the extent that I'm preoccupied with getting through the day without too much hardship or struggle, my attention tends to be disembodied. I do not inquire deeply into why I feel a certain way. I do not question or probe the veracity of my perceptions. I do not submit my intentions to rigorous moral scrutiny. I just muddle along, quote, eaten up by thoughts, taking whatever appears for granted, indulging in the occasional fantasy, not complaining too loudly, and speaking and acting more out of politeness than conviction. Which is kind of like, I mean, I don't want to like muddle terms too much, but that also like strikes me as kind of like behaving like unconsciously, almost like just going on habitual momentum or something, rather than actually bringing attention, or like you say, embodied attention to the situations.
Yeah. And there's a definite imbalance highlighted there, because I think we incline towards the disembodied attention, and we need to cultivate more of the embodied attention. And there's also a factor there, like there's a fakey factor that he kind of describes there, that I think is really important, that I know it definitely resonates for me. I'm sure a lot of other people too, eaten up by thoughts, taking whatever appears for granted, not complaining too loudly, and speaking and acting more out of politeness than conviction.
Right.
Yeah, there's definitely a becoming embodied thing that I think also becomes not just an internal practice, but also like the way we act towards others as well. And I think people appreciate that, or can appreciate that sort of honesty, as opposed to the habitual standards or fakiness,
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of sort of like complex in a way, like, because I feel like maybe some of the way we habitually behave is based on not really wanting to be embodied in how we always feel. Or like, like if you're not having a good day, for example, like to really be embodied in the feeling of heavy weight, like heaviness, and like you don't want to talk to anybody, right? So then, or like, it's hard to, like, I'm just thinking back, for example, to working a retail job for a long time, on those days where you feel sort of like that, or like even not even necessarily extreme, but just like your honest embodied state is not conventionally positive or at its best or something. How to embody how you really are and then interact honestly, it can be kind of tricky, I mean, I definitely think it's possible. Like, I think it's possible to have genuine interactions from how you're really doing, without being rude and without being fake also, like, but it is kind of, it's a practice, right? I mean, to really do that is kind of a practice. But I mean, I guess it all starts with just being willing to have an embodied experience, like whatever that looks like on any given day. And then also just keeping in mind the principle of responding rather than reacting. I would say there's an inspiring level of strength and conviction required to really do that day in and day out,
Yeah.
and we can do it. Just like it's helpful to think about, like, I feel like I can conceive of that, and it's like, that's who I want to be,
Mm-hmm.
like,
Yeah.
which is sort of helpful to think, like, find ways to kind of inspire or motivate ourselves to really be the way that we want to be. Cause I think that it actually is largely within reach.
Yeah. And I think there's a nuance there too of like, can we remain in an embodied attention and then still do the cultural things we need to do? And so to put that another
Right.
way, I think part of what he's describing here, particularly these ideas of like not complaining too loudly, speaking and acting more out of politeness and conviction, I think we can use those things to lie to ourselves about how we're actually feeling. Like, I think we can use those types of means of interacting with our environment as a means of self-deception so that we aren't embodied in our actual situation. So if we aren't feeling great, we can have that disembodied attention and act in these ways as a way of fooling ourselves and in like actually like making an inclination of being less embodied in the moment. We don't like being embodied in this sense. I don't think means you have to tell everybody exactly how you feel or have your outer actions, perfectly reflect your inner feelings. But I do think we have to be able to be embodied fully and also, interface with our environment in a way that's skillful. So there's probably a lot of degrees of how we can do that. But yeah, that embodied intention, that is, like we've talked about in an episode on emotions and in so many other places, I think like that kind of embodied attention of just being able to pay attention to how we feel is so important. And that feeling is, I think, like science-wise, I think that's the neurobiology side in a lot of ways. Like that's our biological inheritance to feel certain ways and in response to certain situations and things we perceive. So like when our mind, our conscious like thinking brain is acting against what our body is neurocepting, like that is a recipe for trouble. And so being able to at least tune in and be embodied and aware of what's happening is a huge step forward. And then there's the question of like, how do we interact with the world based on that? But yeah, I love this idea of embodied attention. And this is what I feel like I really needed after our retreat. I feel like somehow I missed all that. and I honestly undermined it for years.
Yeah. Well, and like to what you're saying too, like the principle of being embodied and then the response, the principle of response is pretty important, because oftentimes if you are in the simple embodied place of however you feel, your response to that could still be to choose to be polite and kind, which is probably recommendable, like instead of just saying like, I'm upset today, so in order to be authentically embodied, I'm gonna just say whatever I want to somebody. It's not quite it. But I do also kind of think, just for the sake of discussion, I do kind of think there's like a middle ground of like, to me, there's usually a way to basically not be fake, but still be polite and authentic. And you know what I mean? Like, it's like if someone asks you how you're doing when you're not having a good day, you can say, I'm doing pretty well overall. Like, we may not feel like saying I'm great, but we also don't want to just be like, man, I feel like shit. Like, that's not doing any good either, But, I find that, like, at least when I was in a situation of interacting with people, like many, many people every day, I think if we can do that kind of like probing task of finding a real thing to say, I think people do appreciate that. It's like it almost sometimes gives people the opportunity to also be that way. Like they might tell you how they're actually feeling, and that might be good for them to do,
Yeah.
But I mean, like it all starts with just knowing how you feel, and then again, like trying to understand how we can respond rather than react.
Yes.
I
Mhm.
feel like that distinction is like huge here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. So one of the quotes I wrote down here is the practice of Dharma starts by paying embodied attention to what is going on. And it sounds so skimple or so skimple. It sounds so simple. And then there's a part here where Mahakotita asks Sariputra what a skillful practitioner should pay embodied attention to. And Sariputra says, pay embodied attention to the 5 bundles as impermanent, dukkha, empty, and not self. These reflections will lead to dwelling happily in this very life, to mindfulness and awareness. So what we're paying attention to is the 5 bundles, and we're recognizing them for what they are, as impermanent, as suffering, as not self. And what that leads to is happiness, which seems a little counterintuitive, but try it. I think that's the idea, really. Like, you guys just got to try this stuff. I mean, there's a lot in here that's counterintuitive. And I think that everybody has a sort of habitual aversion to recognizing impermanence and to thinking about change and uncertainty. That's maybe the main inclination we're trying to highlight here, particularly in the beginning of the Dharma path. Like, we need to really kind of wake up to that inclination and challenge it and see how it works, see what it leads to, because that inclination is, I believe, the main one that's causing a lot of our suffering, is thinking like, oh, well, I need to think about myself as permanent. I need to think about my situation as permanent. And I need to expect good feelings out of everything. I need to just have a general expectation that everything will work how I want it to work, and I'll be happy all the time. And whether we say that explicitly or not, most of us, that's our pattern, so like we need to challenge that with this kind of embodied attention of recognizing impermanence and dukkha and emptiness. And yeah. Oh, and actually he says in here, related to that, he brings up that neurobiological inheritance, evolutionary inheritance, to see the world and ourselves as impermanent and with expectations of satisfactoriness in everything we meet. But we have to encounter that incorrect view. And in another quote here, as he says, embodied attention is thus synonymous with comprehending dukkha, which is the first of the 4 tasks. Good? All right. Part 6. This section is primarily about the idea of no self. And to say that another way, being careful about not prioritizing the sense of self or consciousness. So Batchelor starts out by saying, Gautama's analysis of nama as touch, feeling, perception, intention, and attention may have encouraged early Buddhists to think of name in terms of mental processes, or simply as a synonym for mind. The terms all later came to be classified in the Abhidharma as mental events, a term that does not occur in the discourses. As a result, the continued use of name becomes somewhat of a puzzle. What are these 5 functions why are these 5 functions collectively called name when only one of them, perception, has anything remotely to do with naming things? And he goes on to explain Namarupa as being really closely related with personality and identity. And he even references an Upanishad, a text from the Upanishads that precedes the time of the Buddha, talking about how God becomes differentiated into name form. So everyone we meet is sort of a reflection of God, or a embodied name form of God. And then he gets into this idea of anatta, no self, and the experience of no self, and how when we examine the 5 heaps for the self, the 5 bundles, when we examine those looking for the self, we don't find it. And so therefore, some claim that the Buddha taught that there is no self, that it does not exist, that it's an illusion. I think probably most of us have heard that. But saying that there's no such thing as a self, he uses the analogy is that's sort of like saying that there's no such thing as water, because when you look at the hydrogen and the oxygen molecules, you don't see water there. So we're kind of doing the same thing here. When we see the heaps, we have an experience of the heaps, but we don't see the self in any of them. Does that then mean the self does not exist? And I like that he used the example of water because it's such a basic element of our world. It's not like some abstract thing. It's like these two kinds of molecules come together and we experience water, and I need water. It's really important. So I can't think of that as not real. I'm not going to say there is no water, So the claim that the self is illusory forces us into positions where we need to make a rationale for why the self does seem to have such functions and such importance in making its decisions and impacts on the world. And we end up, we have to employ the two truths to now kind of explain why it appears there's a self, and what the self does matters for the self's future. And we do that a lot of times by saying like, well, conventionally there's a self, but ultimately there isn't a self. And I don't know that would even be necessary if we just said, the self doesn't exist like we think it does, which we do. We say that in our tradition too. But I think a lot of times what gets highlighted is this illusory or not self kind of idea, when in fact we all experience a self, like for sure. We definitely have that experience. So.
Right. Yeah, I did kind of think here about the distinction that we've talked about before, like appearance versus existence. But again, I'm not really sure that necessarily matters to go too much into. I think his point is pretty well made here.
Yeah, and I was going to share the quote here about the bundles or the burden. The burden, that was it. So Stephen Batchelor says, if we think of the Dharma as a task-based ethics rather than a truth-based metaphysics, such intellectual gymnastics become unnecessary. In a short discourse that has given rise to much debate, Gautama declares, I will show you the burden and the carrier of the burden's addition and the burden's relief. He explains that the burden, bara, is the 5 bundles, and the carrier of the burden, barahara, is the person of such and such name and clan. What is added to the burden, baradana, is reactivity/craving, tanha, and the burden's relief, baranikepa, is the fading away and ceasing of that reactivity. That is nirvana. What troubles Orthodox Buddhists is that Gautama appears to give equivalent status to the bundles and to the person who carries the bundles, thus raising the specter of an Atman-like self existing independently of its attributes. That this is seen as problematic reveals the entrenched ontological mindset of commentators. They seem incapable of taking such a statement as anything other than a claim about the existence of a self. Yet the passage could just as well be read as providing a compelling metaphorical frame for contextualizing a person's performance of the fourfold task. So the burden is the heaps, the carrier of the burden is us. What is added to that burden is reactivity, and when we take reactivity away, we give relief. The burden's relief. I like that metaphor. I've definitely never heard that metaphor before, but I'm a fan. A lot of this really does seem like just like really a very fundamental shifting of our perspective on stuff, because why do we have to think that having a carrier of the burden means that there is a forever existing self? Like that seems like a leap that comes from a lot of other habits. Like, why can't we just take it as the way things appear? And when we work within that framework, things, we find more happiness through the practice of the Dharma, and it's more effective.
Right. Yeah, makes sense to me.
And he talks about the burden here as like the fertile field. So to jump back to the metaphors from a previous chapter, like the farmer, cultivates the field. I forget the name of the person who makes arrows, but the person who makes arrows, fashions an arrow, and a sculptor sculpts a beautiful sculpture out of the materials. So So after the introduction of the four tasks, the Buddha is said to have taught this teaching on no self. But Batchelor says there's nowhere in this teaching where he actually claims there is no self. What the Buddha says is, bhikkhus, the body, rupa, is not self. If it were, it would not get sick. You could tell your body, be like this or don't be like that. But because the body is not self, it does get sick. You can't tell it, be like this or don't be like that. He points out that the same is true for feelings, perceptions, inclinations, and consciousness. You cannot determine in advance how you will feel, what you will perceive, how you will be inclined to act, or what you will be conscious of. You do not choose to feel happy rather than sad, to perceive a world that delights rather than disturbs you, to always incline to calm rather than an agitated response, to be unconscious rather than conscious of something distressing. In other words, you are not in charge of what is going on within your own experience. Experience happens to you. Later on, he says, Gautama regards belief in self as the conviction that one is ultimately in charge of one's destiny. So instead of thinking about like a metaphysical claim about like the existence of some permanent self or something like that, to him, the idea of self, as Stephen Batchelor describes it, the idea of self is just like what sense of control you think you have over your sensorium, I guess we could say, your experience, what you meet with.
Mm-hmm.
To add to that point, he says, Gautama is interested in what people can do, not with what they are. The task he proposes entails distinguishing between what is to be accepted as the natural condition of life, the unfolding of experience, and what is to be let go of, reactivity. We may have no control over the rush of fear prompted by finding a snake under our bed, but we do have the ability to respond to the situation in a way that is not determined by that fear. And there's a lot in this chapter, but I do think it's interesting. He comments on someone, Vacchagotta, coming to ask the Buddha about his self, and the Buddha just remains silent. And once the Vacchagotta leaves, the Buddha says to whoever was with him, to affirm or deny would lead to a metaphysical dead end. So just affirm the idea of a self or deny it would lead to a metaphysical dead end, which seems similar, again, to all these questions that he won't answer. And the Buddha also says, bhikkhus, any form, feeling, perception, inclination, or consciousness, whatever, should be seen with complete understanding as it occurs. This is not mind. I am not this. This is not myself. So it really is not about realizing no self, but about realizing I am not the same as or reducible to any of the five bundles that constitute my experience.
Right.
But he also says it's not just about that. For, as he says, not only are we not identical with what makes up our experience, we are not something different from it either. And he quotes the Buddha here. He says, Gautama illustrates this identity in a dialogue with the elder monk Anuruddha. He asks Anuruddha whether Anuruddha can see the Tathagata within each of the five bundles. Anuruddha says no. Gautama then asks whether Anuruddha can see the Tathagata apart from each of the five bundles. Anuruddha replies no. Gautama continues, what do you think, Anuruddha? Do you regard form, feeling, perception, inclination, and consciousness as the Tathagata? No, sir. So what do you think? Do you regard the Tathagata as one who is without form, feeling, perception, inclination, and consciousness? No, sir. The Tathagata, therefore, is not apprehended by you as real and actual here in this very life. But such unfindability of self is not an exclusive property of Gautama. It is equally true of Anuruddha, you, and me. We are a collection of processes. We're not static. We're constantly interacting with and being acted upon by our environment. And that takes us back to the epigraph. You know, if the self were the bundles, it would be something that arises and passes away. If it were other than the bundles, it would not bear their characteristics. Actually, that's not the epigraph, but that's another Nagarjuna quote.
Yeah. I mean, I think all this is like a good clarification especially this passage, that the self is ambiguous, elusive, incapable of being pinned down and defined. And he goes on to say, today we might say that this is because a person is not static, or is not a static, circumscribed thing, but a hub of complex living processes that are continually evolving and changing in vital interactions with the environment. To me, that's the evocation of all this it like lands the best for me, I guess, or kind of comprehensible. But I did have the feeling that like that is the exact description that could be used to illustrate the fact that there is no like inherently existing self. You know, the fact that the self is always basically changing and evolving and manifesting differently depending on circumstance. I mean, that is like the emptiness of self, which I don't think conflicts with what he's saying. I mean, you know what I mean, though? Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's that meeting of like knowing that we're always changing. And in fact, like, I don't think this is entirely true, but I know people always kind of cite that idea that like every 7 years you have new cells in your whole body or something, you know? So like physically I think that's not entirely true, but a lot of us is changing both physically and mentally. And we are very different people, but there's also this experience of continuity. Like we're the only people who know the things that happen to us, you know? And no one else will ever, you know, we can't just download to somebody else our whole perspective on life, you know? So we are at the same time, you know, completely in flux and a continuity, you know?
Right. Yeah, that's true.
There's a lot in this chapter that I took a lot of quotes down. I'm trying not to read them all, but I do want to read this one. For Gautama, experience is what matters. Although we seem to observe ourselves from the perspective of the detached witness, we should not be tricked into believing that the witness is therefore more enduring or reliable than anything else. If we do so, we resist comprehending the world, secure in the conceit that what we really are has nothing to do with the shifting tragic lives of ourselves and others. Embracing dukkha entails abandoning any ontological commitment to a disembodied self or a consciousness that is apart from experience, yet magically peers in on it. Whatever survival advantages such a perspective may have provided our ancestors, believing in it as real holds us back from giving ourselves over totally to life. In this sense, embodied attention is an unflinching participation with what is happening now. It is indistinguishable in the end from love. When I first read that, I did not sense it go in there. And it's really kind of a provocative statement, I think. In this sense, embodied attention is an unflinching participation with what is happening now. It is indistinguishable in the end from love.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I would kind of like him to say more, but.
Yeah. Well, I think I would say like the idea of being present with what is in the moment. If I think of love in terms of probably the first thing that probably most of us think of, like a relationship or something, loving someone, you have to recognize that both of yourselves are changing, you know, and each interaction is fresh and new, and, you know, the needs of the person in that moment may shift and your needs will shift, and strategies of interaction and supporting each other shift, and capacities to extend, grow, and shrink. And so, yeah, I could definitely see that as being like love in the sense of just really being attuned to our own embodiment and the embodiment of another person. But I could also see it in the terms of like just love and life. I mean, that also works just in terms of like interaction with our environment.
Yeah.
And the last part of this chapter gets into how the Buddha himself would use first person singular, aham for I and atta for self, such as when he said, there occurred for me a breakthrough in understanding. And at the time of his death, when he encouraged his followers to rely on themselves as their island or refuge. So the last point here that Batchelor makes, I think, is this idea that one can think of oneself as an ongoing practice. So the self is the project, kind of, and when we have a project we're working on, there is no project that we can just find and put in a box. I mean, maybe if our project is like a diorama or something, but I mean, like the idea of the project is a process, and it happens over time, and there's many factors, and it's thought and its form. I mean, well, it's thought and it's like physical stuff, and it's actions, and it's setbacks and ideas. And so I like the idea of the thinking of the self as an ongoing practice. I think I've always kind of thought of it that way, but I don't think I ever really clearly thought like, oh, that's the self. This idea of self is the practice,
Yeah. I mean, I thought this last section was pretty good. I made a note that you could potentially read the whole section 7, although I don't necessarily think we had to do that, but
yeah. I took a lot of notes in that section. Yeah. And I feel like I'm kind of like a baby again with this material, even though it's not entirely new for us. It's just this presentation is so new that I feel,
right.
I mean, I'm just kind of in a state of wonder and awe about it all.
I feel like, kind of like you're saying, I mean, I'm not educated enough to really be able to speak with total authority about all of this,
Yeah, it is. I mean, and that gets us back to the language thing again, too. I mean, I think this is really developing a way of talking about this that's different, and I have to remind myself sometimes that he was a monk in the Gelug tradition. You know what I mean? So he's not at all unfamiliar with all the stuff we learned, like I'm sure he probably knows it better than us. So,
yeah.
Well, then we jump to part 7, which is a shorter section here at the end. It starts out, as we have seen, Gautama understood awakening as the result of directly knowing how experience comes about. He understood a stream entrant as a person who is no longer confused about experience, and he understood the primary task in practicing the Dharma as comprehending experience. To consider awakening in terms of the workings of the 5 bundles marks a departure from Brahmanic orthodoxy, where the goal of the path is to achieve union with the transcendent and unknowable consciousness or God. If nothing else, Gautama's emphasis on the 5 bundles points to a practice that from the outset is engaged with the specificity and diversity of the world of human experience, rather than seeking an ultimate truth that lies hidden from view. The key to freeing oneself from the repetitive cycles of reactivity and beholding nirvana is attention, Mahasikara, the 5th nama factor. So we've been talking about embodied attention, and here we're explicitly saying like this is the key to freeing ourselves from reactivity. And through embodied attention, we come to know impermanence directly through the 5 heaps. And I don't know that he says it here, but I think we're particularly talking about meditation, I think, and a practice of, intentional attention, putting attention where we want it and where it's productive. And to be specific here, he says, when we disengage from the heaps, that's when reactivity fades. And without reactivity, we're freed. And so he even says, the knowledge arises, I am freed. And I thought that was an interesting sentence too, because I can get when we disengage from the heaps, then reactivity fades because we're no longer identifying with the heaps as ourself. We see these things happen, these aspects of our experience arise, and we're not connected to trying to change them or thinking they are us. So when that reactivity, without that reactivity, he says we are freed, like liberation. I'm assuming that synonymous here with awakening. But I thought it was interesting that he added at the end, the knowledge arises, I am freed. Because I think that the reason I thought that was interesting is it implies again that it's not like life ends or experience ends. We just understand in that moment, we behold, I am freed.
I like, he kind of brings it back around to practical concerns, in this next to the last paragraph. Like talking about how the Buddha parsed experience into the 5 bundles for entirely pragmatic reasons and was not interested in providing a value-free proto-scientific account of the nature of reality. His concern was to offer a paradigm that would optimize the practice of the fourfold task.
Yeah, another quote. I don't know if it's that same paragraph, but he says his means are meant to lead us to experiences of living free from habitual reactivity. Or maybe I said this. His means are meant to lead us to experience of living free from habitual reactivity. And I think the key is so that we see it's possible. Like, I think that's why this experiential aspect and trying to evoke understanding of these is so important, because we need to see, like, both visually and in our experience, that it's possible to have these moments of freedom. And the quote, this is a quote, "This freedom is not an end in itself, but a freedom to embark on a way of life in which human beings can flourish." So it's not an end. It's not like the end of the path. It's like recognizing, like, oh, this is something in any given moment that I can do. And in fact, it makes me happier and it makes the people around me happier, which in turn makes the world a better place, you know? All right. That's all I got. Anything else for you?
I don't think so. No.
All right. So we'll see you next week for chapter 8. Take care.
Bye.